it's an interesting sustainability observation to note that the soils that support annual crops were developed almost probably exclusively under diverse perennial vegetation. And nutrient retention, water uptake efficiency, soil carbon storage are all attributes of natural ecosystems that in no small part are due to that diverse perennial vegetation. And yet, virtually all of our cereals and most of our pulses and oilseed crops are annual crops. The Land Institute, where I am an ecologist, not a plant breeder, and also the director of research, as well as researchers, plant breeders at Yunnan University, and colleagues around the world, are working to develop perennial grain crops. And this is very much an overview talk of these two approaches, not a lot of data about any specific crop, but just so you have an idea of what's going on here. There's two basic approaches that are being taken to develop new perennial grain crops. One is domestication, and the other is wide hybridization. Wide hybridization is essentially taking an already existing elite annual grain crop, crossing it with a perennial relative to try to introgress the genes of perennialism into the annual crop. And at the Land Institute, we're working on perennial wheat and perennial sorghum in particular as wide hybrid crosses. But probably the most successful one of these crosses has taken place at Yunnan University in Kunming, where Dr. Feng-Yi Hu and colleagues have crossed annual rice, Oryza sativa, with a relative from Africa, Oryza longistaminata, to create a perennial rice hybrid. And actually, they made quite a few of these. But one in particular, PR23, has now been commercialized. And while the roots of the perennial hybrid are deeper than the annual, they typically do not go deeper than 50 centimeters to 100 centimeters, the perennial rice. The goal of these wide hybrid projects is actually to continue to capture the attributes of the annual, and that's, we do not seem to get the deep rootedness, at least without trying specifically. And so rice yield and rice quality are two important attributes that have been inherited from the annual rice. And you can see that in Yunnan, the annual checks are about 15 tons of rice per hectare per year over 2 harvests, and that has been approached or matched with the perennial rice hybrid that is now been released as a commercial variety planted on over 3,000 hectares in Yunnan. But just to reiterate the point that the hybrid crosses are not capturing deep rootedness, the perennial sorghum rhizome in the work that we're doing also goes to about 60 centimeters. I mean, this is quite a rhizome. You never see anything like this in annual perennial root systems. But again, it's not particularly a deep-rooted species. However, the domestication projects that we're undertaking do typically have very deep roots to begin with, at least the species that we've chosen to work with. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Kernza and Silphium, since they were featured in the root towers and rhizotrons here. But we're also working on a number of legumes as well. By de novo domestication, essentially what we're doing with perennials is what Neolithic farmers did with annuals, and just cycle after cycle of selection on wild annuals, resulting in a cultivar, resulting in pretty much all the food that we eat today. We're doing the same thing with perennials using modern breeding methods. So hopefully it's not going to take quite as long. It still takes a long time to do this work. Silphium integrifolium is an example of one of these crops. And I put this up because there are some species that have indicators, such as these ray flowers correspond to a seed. And so the number of seeds per flower head is exactly the number of ray flowers that that has, and that's very convenient for selecting on yield in this particular species. This is selected, and this is the unselected. But we went after this species, Silphium, because Weaver, the botanist, who was on a previous slide, and others spoke at length about this crop as being incredibly drought tolerant. It survived the Dust Bowl of the 30s in the Great Plains in the US, and just sticks out as a remarkable species for erratic rainfall that's predicted across the central US in the future. It's already erratic, but even more erratic. So its drought tolerance is well documented. We have done work with placing N15 at different depths in the soil and have seen conclusively it taking up nitrogen from at least 2 meters and a suggestion that it could be even deeper. Intermediate wheatgrass, or the trademark name Kernza, is for the grain that this selected wheatgrass produces, is another domestication project. This is what the fields used to look like where we were breeding Kernza, 10 to 20,000 plants planted at a time. The top 50 to 100 is dug out of the ground and intermated in the greenhouse in the off-season, planted out again. These were the types of cycles of selection. Kernza has been fully sequenced now, or intermediate wheatgrass has, and now there's a very robust genomic selection program happening in this crop, and we're making good progress with that model. Kernza has very robust rooting systems relative to annual wheat. This is just total root biomass in 3 different crop settings, comparing Kernza to annual wheat. And here is a visual of that root distribution in a soil profile at the Land Institute. There are wheat roots that go quite deep here, but obviously the allocation in the Kernza is quite a bit more. So maybe the soil coring will be better in this setting, I'm not sure. These are showing, since it's starting with a wild species, the yield is quite low compared to, say, wheat, something that has been bred for centuries and millennia. And yet, even just through 5 breeding cycles of 2 years each, we can see changes in important domestication attributes, such as seed mass, free threshing, and grain yield. And again, this is before genomic selection program was actually started. And then there is the idea of growing crops in intercropping arrangements. And I put this up here just as a snapshot of some data that we've recently acquired, showing that's very consistent actually with what was found in the root towers and reported on earlier, where Kernza alone has higher soil moisture down at 3 meters than the Kernza alfalfa intercrops in these 2 plots here. And we're very interested in seeing, we put these soil moisture sensors in actually to look for evidence of hydraulic redistribution, which we are pretty sure we've seen in this intercrop system with alfalfa or lucerne and intermediate wheatgrass. But then, of course, this was the wettest summer on record in Kansas, so it was not a particularly good year to look for hydraulic redistribution other than down. In fact, these soil moisture levels are actually pretty unheard of, but it was a really wet year. So, but this was kind of neat. And these data correspond with the deuterium and O18 xylem sap analyses of the alfalfa in these plots compared to a very different signature in the kernza. Again, consistent with what has been found in the root towers in the fields here. And finally, we're just not doing this work alone. There's a lot of people involved, and we welcome more. So thank you.